All right, well, thank you for having me. Everybody you should have a packet in front of you that has a PowerPoint and a participant manual. So if you would, and you should have a report on a bunch of data measures. We're going to be talking about all three of those documents today. So I entitled this Performance Metric, but the real title for many of us is going to be this one, the I Hate Numbers Roadshow. I don't know about you, but when I got in this business, numbers were not part of the equation. In fact, I'm a bit shocked at the stage of life I'm in now, because when my education was around crime theory and best practices and innovative practices, and zoom ahead a couple of decades, and what do I spend most of my time doing now? I read dense research studies, and I work with jurisdictions around things like quality assurance. Are you getting feedback? Or is it just me? You're not getting feedback? I'm working with jurisdictions around things like data and quality assurance, things that I thought I would never actually be talking about. So this is a bit different than I had expected when I started my career. But it's obviously very important for all the reasons we're going to talk about. Here's what we want to get done today. We want to talk about the core elements of an effective performance metric system. We're going to talk about a variety of different measures. We're not going to go through all of them because there are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of them. But I suspect that you have a diverse number of programs in this room that you're representing, and therefore the metrics are going to look very different depending on the program that you're involved in. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to begin the process of quantifying funding-related outcomes. So this is actually going to be a working session. I hope you're sitting next to someone within your program. In other words, if you've got multiple people from your particular county here and you're sitting on different parts of the room, I'm going to ask you at some point to come back together, unless you just don't like each other, in which case you can do it separately. I'm also going to be asking you to be sharing some of the things that we're going to be working on today with people around you, because one of the things that we're going to want to do is to check our logic. And so we're going to hopefully have some dialogue with people about our particular logic. So we're going to begin that process. And then I'm going to ask you to assess your data collection and reporting needs, meaning that I'd like you to kind of take a step back and say, how robust is our data? How robust is our data collection processes? And I suspect in this room, some of you are very advanced, and some of you are going to be very rudimentary when it comes to collecting data. At least that's what I find all across the country. I know Indiana is far ahead of the game in many, many areas, but when it comes to data systems, we find a very diverse set of realities out there. So I'm not going to go over my background. I think most of you have heard me before, but I'm a practitioner by trade. So I'm going to approach this subject with my practitioner lens, meaning that I want things that are practical and easy to do. I don't want things that are overly dense and difficult, so I'm going to try to do that with you today. And by the way, my goal is to change that background slide. That's, as you know, most of you know, I live in Florida, so it's the home of sea turtles, and that's the mama. I want to see the babies hatch. So the next time you see me, it's turtle season. Next time you see me, I'm hoping to have a picture of those hatched turtles. That's on my bucket list. Okay. All right, so I'm going to make some assumptions going forward. The first one is that the health of data systems vary considerably across agencies. We do a lot of work with jurisdictions across multiple states, and here's what we find. Some have really, really outstanding integrated data systems. Not many, but some do. Others are still hand counting. So we're going to make the assumption that we got a pretty diverse set of... Julie, hello. We have a pretty diverse conditions, if you will, of our data systems out there. The second one is that justice agencies tend to excel at their craft and struggle with data. Now, maybe that's not true, but here's what I find, is that if I want to walk up to someone and talk about risk reduction techniques, I can generally have a pretty good conversation. If I want to talk to someone about jail reduction strategies, people are pretty sophisticated around that stuff. But if I walk up to someone in the justice system and say, I would like to talk about your performance metric system, they excuse themselves to go to the bathroom. This is not the kind of thing that most of us have. We didn't get in the business to count, okay? And so this is a little challenging for some of us, including myself, because this is not why I got in the business. However, you can't really achieve the outcomes we're trying to achieve without dipping into the subject matter. Thirdly, many outcomes cannot be easily measured without integrating with other agency data systems. In other words, we don't live on an island and we don't work on an island. We don't collect data on an island. We need court data. We need prosecution data. We need jail data. We need probation data. We need victim data in order to answer the critical questions we're trying to answer. That really gets challenging because there are firewalls and there's data privacy issues and there's HIPAA laws and all these other kinds of reasons why we can't dip into that data to get what we need. So it's a big challenge. Building a performance metric system takes time to do well. Can I put an exclamation point on this one? Building a performance metric system is not something you do overnight. It takes years to do it well. And that's why patience is important. We take baby steps. And that's what makes the Department of Corrections initiative so challenging, is because we're all in a different state of development. We all have different capabilities within our agencies. We all have different stakeholders that are more or less willing to help us access their data. These things take time. Finally, and this is why I'm doing this, look at that last point. In an evidence-based environment, tracking performance outcomes is not a luxury, it's a requirement. You can't call yourself evidence-based and then say, no thanks on the data stuff. Evidence-based means data. And I mean accurate data. And so what we want to do is elevate the capacity of us as practitioners so that we can understand the data, embrace the data, and use the data to improve performance. So these are the assumptions I'm using as we go forward on this whole idea of performance metric system. So we're going to cover three things. We're going to talk about setting the stage around collecting data. We're going to talk about building a performance metric system, what goes into that. And then we're going to talk about how to get started, what are some next steps. So starting with setting the stage. Let's talk about things like what is a performance metric system. Let's talk about the definition of recidivism. This is always one of my favorite topic areas. Often results in a verbal argument. And then examples of measures. All right, so here's a very dense definition of a performance measurement system. It's a systematic method of identifying, recording, compiling, analyzing, reporting, and applying information about an agency's activities and accomplishments, both for our internal purposes and for those external stakeholders. And for those of you who are interested in the general public, it also is a means of communicating with the general public. It's important for legislative bodies, it's important for funding bodies, it's important to us, it's important to the public that we have this system in place. What we don't want the performance measurement system to be is like this little graphic or cartoon. It says, before I make my decision, I'd like to see those meaningless statistics again. We don't want this to be a process of measurement to satisfy a funder or to satisfy the requirements without it being meaningful to us. Any more than we have students who are anxiously awaiting their grades. That's not a meaningless process. We have the NFL draft. It's not meaningless if you're an NFL player wanting to know what draft number you are, because that question and the metrics they use to determine that means millions of dollars of salary. These are not meaningless data. So what we don't want to do is to undergo a process where you're marking the boxes to get the people off your back, as opposed to a sincere effort to understand, are we hitting the mark? Are we using the tax dollars to the maximum benefit? Are we creating a better society as a result of the activities we are performing? That's not a meaningless question. So let's just look here about why we collect performance data. Number one seems pretty obvious: to help the agency perform effectiveness. In other words, we should be making incremental improvement toward whatever effective is. Number two, to demonstrate accountability for achieving our mission. So this is an interesting one, because when I ask correctional departments or prison systems, etc., what is your mission? I often get these statements like public safety. I have no idea what that means in terms of quantifiable definition. What is public safety? Is it safety while the person's in the institution? Is it safety after they're released? Is it about staff safety? Is it about client safety? Is it about future victim safety? What exactly do we mean by public safety? And so when we talk about this thing, accountability, we have to be clear about what our mission is so that we can define it in measurable terms. And so I am surprised, for example, how often I do not get an answer to this question. What is your recidivism rate? Julie knows. We just had that conversation, right?
Do you want to know it?
Sure, share it.
It's 33.6.
33.6%. That is exactly the answer we want. We want people to know a major metric about their performance around their mission. Do you think Pepsi knows what their ultimate performance is supposed to be? What do you think it is? Profits. Exactly, profits. Would you walk up to a Pepsi executive and say, what are your profits? And he or she goes, I don't know. Of course not. And yet all across the country, when I ask, what's your recidivism rate, I get a blank stare. Not in today's world. Thirdly, to provide information for practitioners and our stakeholders. Here's another interesting thing I observe all across the country. I might get a Julie who knows the answer, but then I go talk to staff and I say, what's your recidivism rate? They go, I don't know. No one ever tells me that stuff. If I'm in Pepsi and it's a profit-sharing organization, do you think I know the profits? Because it directly impacts me. We don't do a very good job of translating that metric to the people doing the work. We don't communicate this very well. So I'm delighted in the rare times that the leaders know what the recidivism rate is, but what I really want to see is when everybody in the organization knows what that is. Because that tells me we're driving to the same outcome. We know what that outcome looks like, sounds like, and what that measurement is, and we're working toward it. This idea of getting on the same page means we need to understand what that page is supposed to be saying. That information is important to the internal people. It's also important to the practitioners and the stakeholders. We want to demonstrate the need for additional resources. One of the best things that I ever did by accident was this. When I was a chief probation officer, my caseload size for my felony probation officers was 185 per agent. I knew that was terrible. So I started calling around. I started finding out what other caseload sizes were. And I started asking people like the American Probation and Parole Association, what is the proper caseload size? And I finally got something that I could hang my hat onto that was called a standard. Now I could take that 185 and I can compare it to the standard, and I can go to my funders and I say, look at this. We are way off the mark. Now I can work toward hitting the mark. It's important information if I want additional resources. To document improvements in performance, of course. To conduct program evaluation so that I know whether or not the program is the reason I'm having success. And then, look at that last one, to celebrate success. This is another area we fall short. We should be celebrating success. Julie, that's a really awesome rate when you compare it to other... Now, we have to talk about how you define recidivism, right? But that's a pretty dang good rate when I think about other states. We ought to be celebrating this. How often do we do that? So there's lots of reasons why we want to collect this data. I would like to ask you, name one company that doesn't know their key performance data. One successful company. You'd be hard-pressed. McDonald's knows it. Starbucks knows it. Besides profits, what's a key performance indicator for Starbucks, do you think? What is important to Starbucks in addition to profits, do you think? Quality, excellent. How do you measure quality? Customer service or what? Customer feedback, excellent. Or do they come back, right? Very good. One more. Key indicator for Starbucks. Market share. Who said that? Excellent. Market share is a great one. That's why I like to talk about Pepsi, because I've talked about this before. Coke has a BHAG. You know what a BHAG, right? You've heard that before. BHAG is a big, hairy, audacious goal. It has one BHAG, Coke does. And if you talk to the Coke executives, they'll tell you what their BHAG is. It is to crush Pepsi. Because if they can crush Pepsi, they will dominate the market. What's your BHAG? So we know Starbucks BHAG, in a sense, is profits, right? But here's a key indicator that's also extremely important. Tell me if you agree with this. Wait time. Have you ever been to a Starbucks where the line goes out of the Starbucks and into the road? Or into the, not the road, sorry, on the sidewalk, right? I don't know about you, but Starbucks excels at this idea that we serve coffee fast. No, we serve quality coffee fast. Now, I don't know if you're a Starbucks fan. I'm a coffee snob. There are only two things I care about when it comes to putting something down my gut. Number one is coffee. Number two is wine. I'm very particular. Not at the same time. Serve me a bad wine and I put my nose up and I say, get that away from me. I'm the same way with coffee. I stay a lot at Hampton Inns because they're convenient. They have the world's worst coffee. Starbucks cares about quality, but they also care about wait time. Because they know people like me and people like you don't have time to stand in line. And so I can't tell you how many times I've gotten free coffee at Starbucks because the coffee maker was on empty and I had to wait for 2 minutes. And they said, really sorry, free coffee. Because this is a major metric for them. You have similar metrics that are important, that are critically important, that contribute to your ultimate mission. We need to identify what those metrics are. Now here's another problem we have, is some of us collect too much information. And it gets buried. All the important metrics get buried in that. So we want to come up with a few metrics that really matter. Wait time is one for Starbucks. All right. So this is an interesting quote that came out of the Pew Foundation, 2008. It reads, many community corrections agencies lack a systematic approach to performance measurement that would enable them and their key stakeholders and constituents to effectively judge how well the agencies are accomplishing their goals. Where performance measures exist, most are primarily activity counts. Ka-ching, 2008. I'm going to switch that to 2018, and it's still true. It's still true. Now, we're doing better. And I know Indiana's doing better. I know places like Oregon and Ohio are doing better. We don't ever want to see this quote again in an evidence-based environment. Counting activities is the most basic form of metrics. We want to measure outcomes. So, we want to move toward performance-based funding. This is what's happening all across the country. It's not just in Indiana. The whole idea of justice reinvestment is not a new concept. This idea that we can reduce prison populations and reduce jail populations and use that funding that we would have spent on expensive incarceration to pay for things like community corrections and other programs. It's not a new concept. Performance incentive grants. It's happening all across the country now, including obviously right here. In the state of Pennsylvania, their juvenile grant money that the state issues is directly related to the degree to which they're adhering to evidence-based practices. Because they determined their BHAG was reducing risk. Performance-based budgeting in North Carolina. Their state budgets are based on performance. Performance-based funding for higher education, incentive funding. You get more money when you achieve your outcomes. And finally, the federal government also has requirements around performance and identification of research to back the budget request. This is not a new concept. What we've not done a very good job with is putting all the pieces together, which is what today is all about. So how should community corrections be measured? Let's just use that as an example. Should we be measured on activities? How many pre-sentence reports we do? How many intakes we have? How many program slots we fill? Should we be measured on activities? Should we be measured on the difficulty or risk of clientele? In other words, should funding be reliant on the risk of the people you're dealing with? This is how Oregon used to do it. I don't know if they're still doing it, but they would literally take the number of people who are low risk, medium risk, and high risk, and they'd have a formula, right? And the more high risk people you get, the more money you get, right? Because it makes sense in that the risk level of the client, as it goes up, the intensity of effort needs to go up. Okay? It's another way to think about it. How about this one? Contribution to saving to the state. We did this in Minnesota. The more you reduce the people who went to prison, the more money you got. Or should we be measured on specific outcomes? This is a big question. This is the question that the state is struggling with. This is the question locals struggle with. What is it ultimately that we want to measure? Because this whole idea is what gets measured gets done means that this is a pretty critical question, isn't it? Because that's what drives us. the metrics are going to be what drives us. So we better get this right. So here are examples of possible measures. The rate of jobs acquired, the level of education achieved, the rate of restitution collected, the number of people diverted from the costly justice system process, the number of program completers, and so on and so forth. These are all good measures, depending on what your ultimate goal is for your program. Racial disparity. There are people who are getting grant funding, right, for racial disparity. That would be a perfect kind of outcome we're going to look for when it comes to that particular issue. Increase in protective factors. It's not just about risk factors, it's also preventative in nature. So we could look at protective factors. The list goes on and on. But recidivism is the most common outcome measure. It's the holy grail that most jurisdictions hang their hat on. I don't want to imply it's the only one. And I suspect there are programs represented in this room for which recidivism is not the proper measure. However, for the majority of objectives that we are undertaking, recidivism is one of the critical measures. It seems simple enough, but collecting recidivism data, defining recidivism data, can get a little complicated. So I'm going to increase its complication here by talking about this in ways that we have seen across the country. Now, we do have a little problem. There is no national standard, and many have tried. Usually there is no state standard and there is no local standard. There is no common definition of recidivism. Why is that the case so often? Why don't we have a common definition? After all, we can agree on this. What's the problem?
These people leave, you don't hear from them again, and they work real hard to make sure you don't hear from them.
You mean the clients leave and you don't hear from them for a long time?
And they don't want to hear from you, so they make themselves scarce.
Okay, so they make themselves scarce. So we can't find out how things are working long term. Okay, great. Yes, sir. Very good. Lack of resources. That's a big one, especially in areas, you got 6 people in your department. Where are you going to get these? What's another one?
No universal place to go. We all have access to check on every person we have everywhere. Right now I'm limited, in checking. I can figure out in my counties or in Indiana possibly, but I have no means to see.
So let me see if I get this right. I might be able to get local data, I might be able to get state data, but I might not be able to get national data, right? It's a huge issue. Very good. Yeah.
The definition for the prisons are those people who come back into prison, but on the local level, it is the misdemeanor convictions, that kind of disparity is making it difficult to have a definition.
It's a whole different animal, right? Did they come back to prison versus did they pick up a new misdemeanor conviction? That's apples and oranges if you ever saw one, right? Yeah.
The data's out there. A key problem is that the siloed technology, being able to reach out and have systems talk to each other.
Okay, very good. So the data may be there, but the systems need to be able to dip into that data and help you and talk back and forth. Very good. I'm sorry, I should walk over here. I've not talked to this side of the room. Any others? Okay, these are all good ones, right? Yes.
People fighting over what the measurements are, or they want to make sure that it's most advantageous to them.
Self-interest? What a cynic. You're exactly right. I can tell you stories of arguments I've had with people who wanted to pick the measure that was most likely to make them look best, right? And that's not what this is all about. Excellent. All correct. Without a standard definition, we can't compare, can we? So when Julie says it's 30, what did you say, 33.6%, can we compare that figure with what's happening in Alabama? Depends on what Alabama's collecting, right? I bet you my last dollar they have a different definition than you do. Yeah.
Uses our data.
Oh, really?
So every state DOC follows that for their recipients.
And no kidding. Okay, I just learned something. So ASCA follows that same definition you're using, and every state is using that for prisons. Good to know. That's progress. Okay, so here's your question. Is a 30% recidivism rate good or bad? So I want you to know, I want you to answer this question. If you got 30% recidivism rate, is that good or is that bad? It's great. What do you think? Exactly. Why don't we know? You're reading ahead? Okay, we don't know, right? There's a lot of things we have to answer before we can say is that good or bad. So let's take a look at those. We don't know whether that's a good rate because we don't know what that definition is, do we? If I said recidivism is they don't commit another crime in the first week that they're on my program, how's that? I bet I get good results, right? Yeah.
When we first started measuring in 2005, it was 39%.
39.
We qualified.
Yeah.
That's why I'm proud of it.
That's right. So this is exactly what we want. We want to see things over time, don't we? And we don't want the definitions to change over time. We want it to be the same in 2005 as it is in 2017 so that we can see progress. Exactly. So we have to have some baseline data. You had 2005 baseline data, didn't you? I heard Kristen talk about this. We need baseline data. We can't tell whether we're making improvement without baseline data. That's the first step after you clean up your data. Right? Baseline. We have to know, look at that last bullet. We have to know what's realistic from a research point of view. Let's say I'm running a program of high-risk offenders and my recidivism rate is 15%. And I define that as rearrest for a misdemeanor or felony within 5 years after discharge. And my recidivism rate is 15%. What would you say about that? Wow, right? That's amazing. You look at any risk tool and it'll tell you what percent of those high-risk offenders will likely come back on new arrest, and it's really high. In a jurisdiction I will not repeat, but it's in California, their recidivism rate for probationers was 92%. If I got a 15%, I'd be doing a jig. Is that realistic from a research point of view? No. No. The research suggests that a high-risk offender is likely going to recidivate, depending on your risk tool, somewhere between 50 and I'm going to say 80% of the time. And you can get, realistically, if you do things right, a 30% reduction in recidivism. You're not going to get close to 15%. Now, if you did, you better write it up and go on the road and make some money. Because that would be amazing. So we got to be realistic here, right? Anybody who says they get that kind of recidivism rate for the high-risk offender, the first thing I do is I doubt the numbers. Because from a research point of view, that doesn't make sense. All right. So here's an example. Julie, this is exactly what we're talking about with your data. This is an example of what we're talking about. If you see that green line there, that is the baseline recidivism rate. This is made up data now. This is the baseline recidivism rate at 37.4%. The initiative began in 2014. After the initiative, recidivism went up a slight amount, 2015, it was basically at the same again. Now look at 2016, 2017, we're starting to see that recidivism drop. Now I'm starting to see a trend line measured against a baseline data point. Okay? All right. Quick little exercise, if you would. In your packet, I'd like you to put on your critical hat now. Everybody's got one of these, right? A critical hat. Cynical, critical. Okay, you got it? Now, I want you to look at these recidivism measures in your packet. What page is that? Page 2. With the person next to you, or you could do it by yourself, or you could do it in a large group. Here's all I want you to do. I'd like you to criticize each of these measures. In other words, what I'd like you to do, page 2, what I'd like you to do is say, what is the possible problem or challenge with that definition? Okay? So go ahead and scratch them out. Of clients rearrested for a felony 3 years after discharge. What's a potential problem or challenge with that one? Data not available. Very good. How about the definition itself? What if the charge is dismissed? Very good. So rearrest does not necessarily mean conviction. Very good. Definition of what discharge means. Successful or unsuccessful. Okay, very good. What do we know? Let's look at the rearrest rate factor definition. What do we know about problems with rearrest rates? Is it not true that people who live in disadvantaged communities are arrested more than people who are not? We know there's racial disparity in all areas of our society. Is it possible that arrest is also a racial disparity practice in a local community? So this is one of the challenges with rearrest rates. Okay? All right. Second one, percent of clients reconvicted for felony 3 years after discharge. What are new ones, new problems with that one? Say again?
What about misdemeanors or rearrests?
Right, where are misdemeanors in there? So I can commit 10 new shoplifting charges, and that's not recidivist. So felony is a limited definition, is it not? Any others? Yeah.
None of the sides of the county, or to be in the court system, they can get arrested and not get to the sentence.
Okay, very good. Now you're bringing up another factor, and that is the speed by which the justice system moves people through. Interesting idea. That's right. It's possible. Good. So these are challenges, right? I asked you to put your critical hat on. You're doing a great job. Number 3, percent of clients who receive a violation of probation. What's wrong with that one? Potentially. Yes, who said that? All right. Is it not true that different probation departments violate at different rates depending on the culture of their community or the bench or the prosecution? PO to PO. That's right. It's very true. We get disparate rates among probation officers. Okay, so we also have some logistical issues collecting that data.
Violation of termination.
Yeah.
A sanction that they're receiving is part of violation.
And is it not true, just to add to that, is it not true that there's a big difference between technical violations and violations due to a new criminal activity? And some departments lump those together and don't separate them out. So now we don't really know what the behavior was about that violation, too. Okay, very good. Number 4, percent of inmates are reincarcerated 3 years after re-entry. Sorry? Yeah, that would be anything, right? Criminal activity or a technical violation. Okay. So where they re-enter to, okay? Okay, so we don't define that very well, do we? Incarcerated where? Very good. Let's just do one more. Percent of domestic violence offenders who are arrested for a new DV offense. That's right. So we're limiting it to DV. Now I understand why this often is a measure of a DV initiative, because we want to know whether or not we're stopping future DV crimes. Fair enough. but it does limit what we're looking at, doesn't it?
All the crimes are reported.
Thank you. Not all DV crimes are reported. In fact, we know from the research literature that DV has low reporting rates. So now are we really, is this the right measure? Or do we need to contact the victims to find out whether the activity occurred even though the arrest was not made? Right? Yes, sir.
I just back off topic, but awkward way you're going through this. When I studied public policy years ago, when I was at this department, federal, state, local, city, name, county, government, every time I went. When the Denny Revolution came in with the metrics, and we tried to apply to government after business record, this problem still exists in government. Sample size, we don't play, we don't pay enough attention to statistical significance of sample size.
Right.
Indiana has about 80 little tiny counties, and then a big metro area down. And it manifestly up there, each and every one of these counties is within 4%. You try to follow one of these trend lines,
Yeah.
within just a county sample size, counties of 15,
Beautiful.
30, 40 stuff.
Beautiful.
Not having enough data points to make any-
Great point. Great point. So when you got small n size, right? Using percentages because it becomes a problem. In fact, we used to get out of the state of Minnesota, we used to get county by county report card on the increase or decrease in the use of prison at the local level. And we would see some jurisdictions with an 80 to 100% increase, even more than 100% increase in prison rates when they only sent 3 people to prison prior year, right? So now they sent 5 and they've got a 67% increase. It looks like, they run amok, right?
And even worse, because none of layers, for example, crimes are federal.
Yeah.
Very small county, 20,000 people who have a big revenue. That's 5%, by the way, it's not that. NACP standards say that I'm not supposed to have more than 30 participants per casework.
Yeah.
You got to give me some more money, but I don't know. So I'm never going to have more. That's my high.
Yeah.
So I don't know how this is going to really work.
Well, these are some of the challenges that we're going to have to work out through this process. Exactly right. And as you just pointed out, maybe we don't use percentages in some cases, we use numbers. And even numbers can be a little challenging. But this is exactly the discussion we're going to need to have. Great comments. Okay. What's the point of this exercise? Torturing you? What? To show discrepancy, right? To show how complicated even a simple thing like recidivism can be. To be able to look at it with a critical eye and come up with something that makes sense for you based on what's true for your particular jurisdiction. Rural versus urban, data you can collect, data you can't collect, etc. So these are some of the challenges, right? What is recidivism? Is it re-arrest charges filed as opposed to just re-arrest? At least there's some method of critique about the arrest when you look at charges filed. Do we look at reconviction? Do we look at technical violation? Do we look at reincarceration? All right. So here's a few other questions to ask, because did they get re-arrested or not is a single layer question, right? Look at these other ones. How about the type of new offense? Do we care whether they committed a violent crime versus a non-violent crime? It might be really important to separate violent versus non-violent. How about the level of new offense? Do we care if they came in on a traffic versus a felony? Sure we do. What about frequency of new offenses? What if the average rate of new offenses for recidivists was 3 crimes before they got arrested, or 3 charges, and now you're down to 1.5? Does that matter? Sure does. Frequency of new offenses. If you've got multiple new offenses, do you count just the most serious charge? Or do you count all of them? What if the offenses were committed on the same day? So I got high, and then I did a burglary, and then I punched the officer. I got 3 charges. How do you handle that? Or what if I went on a crime spree over 6 months? I committed crime here, and then went to Texas. I committed crime there, and then along the way back to Indiana, I committed more crimes, and I committed 10 crimes in the course of 6 months before I got arrested. Do you count that? And what about time to failure? In other words, if I got a 5-year sentence and I spent 3 years in the institution and 2 years in the community, should that be accounted for? My at-risk time was only 2 years. So anyway, I'm just raising these issues because when you count recidivism, you're going to have to think through all this. And then we got the length of time. What's a sufficient amount of time to understand whether your impact was significant? So is it 1 year? Is it 2 years? Is it 3 years? There's a brand new EJS study that came out. I don't know if you saw it. but they actually tracked people over 9 years. And what they found is that people were still committing crime at year 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And so the real recidivism rate, now these were for people coming out of prison, don't quote me because I'm not sure I got it exactly right, but it was something like 85% when you watch over 9 years. Right now, if you look at the last statistic we got from BJS on this, 67% of people coming out of prison were committing a new crime. But when you look at a 9-year period, we're up to 85%. So how long do we track people? All right, so I told you I was going to complicate this definition. Did I succeed? Good. Now let's uncomplicate it. Let's follow some recommendations from the CJCA, or the association, on recommendations on how to measure recidivism. They recommend that you include adjudication for youth and conviction for adults in your definition. Okay, so this is to get at that issue of rearrest rates. Rearrest is not enough to really know what's going on, so they're recommending you look at reconviction data. They also recommend that you identify critical demographic information: age, first-time offenders, gender, etc. That you identify the sources of the data for each data element. And this is when I could not agree more on. More than one measure of recidivism should be used. More than one measure of recidivism. So personally, this is just the world according to Mark. I have no authority to say this. This is just my personal opinion. I like the trifecta, right, which is rearrest, reconviction, violation. That gives me a more well-rounded picture of what's happening. Okay? And if those figures are out of whack, I'm going to unpack that some. Yeah. Violation of supervision for which they were revoked. So again, just my opinion, take it for what it's worth, but I like this idea of 3 sides to the question. Okay? All recidivism tracking should include either education for juveniles or conviction as a measure of recidivism. I guess I already covered that. The follow-up, now look at this last one. The follow-up period for targeting an individual's recidivism should be at least 24 months. I agree with that too. My preferred number is 36 months. And I say that because if you look at survival rates of recidivists, what you'll see for, now I'm not talking about prison, I'm talking about community folks. People who are placed in the community. Generally, what you'll see is if they are going to violate, commit another crime, they're going to do it somewhere within 24 and 36 months, closer to the 24 months period. 36 months should give you enough time. So if you haven't been rearrested or reconvicted within 36 months, good chance you're not going to. Yep.
When you start, you say it's based on their week, so like no work weeks, are you saying you start counting the day I release them, or the day like they have to do probation or roll after they do out, or they finish that part? Like where did you start?
Generally, the recommendation you start it after they're out of a secure environment. In other words, they can commit a crime within a secure environment, but there's a suppression effect there.
So if I release them today, they still have 2 years left doing probation. I'm following a 2-year probation period.
You could follow the 2-year probation period, or you could wait, and you can also continue to track them after they're done with probation, but definitely during that 2-year period of time. Yeah. And again, this is a judgment call on your part. I can't answer that for you. It's something you're going to have to discuss with your stakeholders about what would be most meaningful for them. But they are at risk at the moment they leave your facility, and that would be a good measure. And then typically we'd like to see further tracking after there's no more criminal justice involvement in their life. They've been discharged. That's going to tell us whether we had a long-term impact.
Definition, same knocks as you have in Al County, you have Lake County.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the state people, no? Because that is a question for them. So do we want to come up in the state of Indiana, if I got it right, a common definition that would be used across all? And you don't have to answer this now. I'll give you 35 minutes, okay? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, JRAC is coming up with definition.
Okay.
So they will probably be the source of that, and they are looking at something like you stressed, which you mentioned.
Okay. So JRAC is coming out with something. Is that then going to be recommended for folks in this room to use? It is. Okay.
So, framework you don't use
we are going to ask you to do some work in your individual program area around building a performance metric construct. Say that 3 times fast. What we want to do in this section is clarify your outcome goals. We want to get really, really specific about why your program exists, because all the measures should derive from that. We'd like to talk for a minute about theory of change. In other words, it's important that you understand what your theory is. What is it that you believe your assumptions about the activities that will cause that particular event to happen. And then finally, we're going to do a little introduction around logic modeling. Don't worry, this is logic model light. I know some of you bolt from the room when you hear the word logic modeling, but we're going to do a little bit of logic modeling just to think through how to connect A to B to C. Okay, so that's what's up. So we're going to take a look, if you will, at 3 things that kind of interrelate. Your theory of change, which will feed your logic model, which will feed your data system development, which will provoke the question, what is the capacity of your data system? So let's take a look at these steps. We're going to look at theory of change, and we're going to look at contextual conditions. So if you've done logic modeling, you understand this. Contextual conditions are some of those things that we had talked about earlier. I've got a new prosecutor, I've got a new chief judge, I've got a new highway coming through my county, etc. These are contextual conditions that will change your model, potentially. We've got outcomes and activities that should produce the intended results. And then we have to map out your data needs. And finally, what we all want to get to is to collect and disseminate the data. All right, so let's take a look at the first one, theory of change. So theory of change, very simply, it's a descriptor, if you will, that describes how, why, under what conditions a desired change is expected to happen. Okay? We all have them. We all know what they are in our heads. We want to get it out on paper, and we want to test it out. So it could be something very broad, like how about this one? People change when the rewards are greater than the punishers. In other words, when you act a certain way and you get rewarded for it, that motivates you to do the right thing as opposed to the punishers. So when incentives and rewards outweigh punishers, people behave the right way. If that's your theory of change, you're going to have a particular model that reflects that. Okay? So there are many, for example, economists who would buy that idea. When rewards outweigh the punishers, people will behave. That's a theory of change. Or it could be something very specific, like that last bullet says, low-risk individuals have pro-social assets and social capital to learn from their mistakes and therefore need limited intervention. If that's your theory of change, you're going to act a certain way. So have you noticed that sometimes when you talk to justice system partners, you find yourself disagreeing about this theory of change? People will not change until they hear the jail cell door slam. Have you heard that before? How many have heard this? I changed when I joined the Marine Corps and went through boot camp. Now that theory of change assumes that the offender is going to respond to a boot camp experience like this particular individual who makes that statement. That's their theory of change. Theory of change needs to be challenged to vet it, to determine whether or not it's on solid ground. We want to challenge your theory of change. That's what I'm going to ask you to do in small groups. I want you to articulate your theory of change. And I would like a dissertation I want you to present to your group. And they will challenge your theory of change. Okay? See, now you regret coming back from lunch, don't you? Okay. Theory of change. So here's an example. Stanley, age 17, says to himself, if I give Rhonda a dozen roses in front of her algebra classmates tomorrow, she will agree to go to the prom with me. What is Stanley's theory of change? Cause and effect. What does he think cause and effect is? What's his theory of change? Okay, one thing, possibility, if I do something nice to me, she's going to respond favorably. Right? Very good. What's another possible theory of change? Yeah. Yeah, he's intentionally doing this in front of his class. So if I can publicly do this, she is likely going to whatever, whether that's out of appreciation or out of embarrassment, she's going to go to the prom with me. That's another part of his theory of change. What would you challenge about that? What else would you challenge about that theory of change? Her love language. What does he think she will respond to? Gifts, or in this case, specifically roses. What if she's allergic to flowers? What if she hates roses? What if the thorns cause her to bleed? Whatever. He's got a theory here. Theories are often flawed. So these are the things that we have to think through before we develop our activities and our outcome. Now, here's a correctional example. This happened to me, in fact. The judge is routinely ordering electronic monitoring as a sentencing condition, expecting that it will reduce future crime. What is the judge's theory of change? The electronic monitoring does what? It deters them. That's good. What's another part of that? That it reduces recidivism. What specifically does electronic monitoring do to reduce recidivism? Well, that's how we challenge him, right? But for some reason, he thinks it will. It restricts their movement, and therefore, what's going to happen? They won't have the opportunity, but what happens when electronic monitoring goes away? Right? This is the problem. Now, this actually happened to me. I had a judge who, I was the chief probation officer, who came to me and says, Mark, I want to know what the recidivism rate for people on electronic monitoring. And I said, Judge, we don't even collect the data. He goes, what? I said, we don't collect it because I have no evidence that says electronic monitoring reduced future crime. And his jaw dropped. He said, Mark, I have been sentencing people to electronic monitoring for years thinking it was reducing recidivism. I said, Judge, I'm sorry if I give you that idea, but it ain't there. Do you think those assumptions like that happen frequently in the justice system? Yeah. So we want to get really clear about what our theory of change is. So here are things that justice system officials think a lot about. When it comes to change behavior, what do many justice system officials think employment does? It has a big impact on recidivism, right? And why do they think that? Yeah, they're out doing work, they're not out committing crime, right? What's the problem with that? They do get off of work. And if I have antisocial attitudes, what do I do when I'm at work? Do crime. We actually have a lot of research on this. When the employment rate drops in the United States, when we have high unemployment, the crime rate barely moves. It goes up a tiny little bit. A tiny little bit. So this assumption that we give people jobs, we're halfway there, not true. Now, we want to do this. There's lots of reasons to do this. But this idea that employment is a big contributor to crime is not true. Same thing we know about substance abuse. It's a big deal in our system, but a lot of people think substance abuse is the begin and end all. Mental health, same thing. How about the use of AA as a court condition? You're ordered to attend AA during your time of supervision. What is the theory of change? Stages of change? Say more about that. Okay.
They're not going to be able to change. Well, they won't change if they don't recognize the problem.
Very good. So if you're in the pre-contemplative stage, my theory of change is if I order you to go to AA, you're going to move from pre-contemplative to the next stage to next stage, right? Very good. Now, I still am looking for the evidence to see that that's true. What we want to do in this section is clarify your outcome goals. We want to get really, really specific about why your program exists, because all the measures should be derived from that. We'd like to talk for a minute about theory of change. In other words, it's important that you understand what your theory is. What is it that you believe your assumptions about the activities that will cause that particular event to happen. And then finally, we're going to do a little introduction around logic modeling. Now, don't worry, this is logic model light. I know some of you bolt from the room when you hear the word logic modeling, but we're going to do a little bit of logic modeling. Just think through how to connect A to B, C. Okay, so that's what's up. So we're going to take a look, if you will, at three things that kind of interrelate. Your theory of change, which will feed your logic model, which will feed your data system development, which will provoke the question, what is the capacity of your data system? So let's take a look at these steps. We're going to look at theory of change, and we're going to look at contextual conditions. So if you've done logic modeling, you understand this. Contextual conditions are some of those things that we had talked about earlier. I've got a new prosecutor, I've got a new chief judge, I've got a new highway coming through my county, etc. These are contextual conditions that will change your model, potentially. We've got outcomes and activities that should produce the intended results, and then we have to map out your data needs, and then finally, what we all want to get to is to collect and disseminate the data. All right, so let's take a look at the first one, theory of change. So theory of change is very simply, it's a descriptor, if you will, that describes the how, why, under what conditions a desired change is expected to happen. Okay? We all have them. We all know what they are in our heads. We want to get it out on paper, and we want to test it out. So it could be something very broad, like how about this one? People change when the rewards are greater than the punishers. In other words, when you act a certain way and you get rewarded for it, that motivates you to do the right thing as opposed to punishers. So when incentives and rewards outweigh punishers, people behave the right way. If that's your theory of change, you're going to have a particular model that reflects that. Okay? So there are many, for example, economists who would buy that idea. When rewards outweigh the punishers, people will behave. That's a theory of change. Or it could be something very specific, like that last bullet says, low-risk individuals have pro-social assets and social capital to learn from their mistakes, and therefore need limited intervention. If that's your theory of change, you're going to act a certain way. So, have you noticed that sometimes when you talk to your justice system partners, you find yourself disagreeing about this theory of change? People will not change until they hear the jail cell door slam. Have you heard that before? How many have heard this? I changed when I joined the Marine Corps and went through boot camp. Now that theory of change assumes that the offender is going to respond to a boot camp experience like this particular individual who makes that statement. That's their theory of change. Theory of change needs to be challenged to vet it, to determine whether or not it's on solid ground. We want to challenge your theory of change. That's what I'm going to ask you to do in small groups. I want you to articulate your theory of change. And I would like a dissertation. I want you to present to your group. And they will challenge your theory of change. Okay? See, now you regret coming back from lunch, don't you? Okay. Theory of change. So here's an example. Stanley, age 17, says to himself, if I give Rhonda a dozen roses in front of our algebra classmates tomorrow, she will agree to go to the prom with me. What is Stanley's theory of change? Cause and effect. What does he think cause and effect is? What's his theory of change? Okay, one thing, possibility. If I do something nice to me, she's going to respond favorably, right? Very good. What's another possible theory of change? Yeah. Yeah, he's intentionally doing this in front of his class. So if I can publicly do this, she is likely going to whatever, whether that's out of appreciation or out of embarrassment, she's going to go to the prom with me. What's another part of his theory of change? What would you challenge about that? What else would you challenge about that theory of change? Her love language. What does he think she will respond to? Gifts. Or in this case, specifically roses. What if she's allergic to flowers? What if she hates roses? What if the thorns cause her to bleed? Whatever. He's got a theory here. Theories are often flawed. So these are the things that we have to think through before we develop our activities and our outcomes. Now, here's a correctional example. This happened to me, in fact. The judge is routinely ordering electronic monitoring as a sentencing condition, expecting that it will reduce future crime. What is the judge's theory of change? The electronic monitoring does what? It deters them. That's good. What's another part of that? That it reduces recidivism. What specifically does electronic monitoring do to reduce recidivism? Well, that's how we challenge him, right? But for some reason, he thinks it will. It restricts their movement, and therefore, what's going to happen? They won't have the opportunity. What happens when electronic monitoring goes away? Right? So see, this is the problem. Now, this actually happened to me. I had a judge who I was the chief probation officer and came to me, he says, Mark, I want to know what the recidivism rate for people in electronic monitoring. I said, Judge, we don't even collect the data. He goes, what? I said, we don't collect it because I have no evidence that says electronic monitoring reduces future crime. And his jaw dropped. And he said, Mark, I've been sentencing people to electronic monitoring for years thinking it was reducing recidivism. I said, Judge, I'm sorry if I gave you that idea, but it ain't there. Do you think those assumptions like that happen frequently in the justice system? Yeah. So we want to get really clear about what our theory of change is. So here are things that justice system officials think a lot about. When it comes to change behavior, what do many justice system officials think employment does? It has a big impact on recidivism, right? And why do they think that? Yeah, they're out doing work, they're not out committing crime, right? What's the problem with that? They do get off of work. And if I have antisocial attitudes, what do I do when I'm out?